Hey there, what are you doing?
Just looking at birds.
Welcome. I'm your host, Chris. Join me as I interview avid birders to learn more about birds, birding, and those who love both. Today I have two guests, Bob and Prudy Bowers. They moved to Arizona almost 20 years ago. They both love photographing, studying, and writing about birds for publications in Arizona, Colorado, and Mexico. Bob and Prudy volunteer at the Catalina State Park to help people learn more about birds and also lead birding field trips for the Tucson Audubon Society. It's good to have you both here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One thing I didn't mention a moment ago was that Bob and Prudy conduct a quarterly bird count at Willow Springs Road and Catalina Regional Park. I noticed the most recent post on your website referenced a Christmas bird count. For some of our listeners who have heard of these bird counts, but don't really know much about them beyond the name and the fact that birds are counted around Christmas, what else should they know?
Well, the Christmas bird count started in 1900, and it was started by the curator of the Natural History Museum, I think in New York, which became the Smithsonian. And that same individual actually founded the Audubon Society a couple of years after 1900. Prior to 1900, there was an event called the Sides event. Every Christmas, people who were interested in participating would sign up for one of two sides. And these two sides then on Christmas Day would take to the field and go out and look for birds. Their objective was to kill as many birds as they could possibly kill.
Oh.
They took guns with them and they shot birds right and left to try to kill more birds than the other side. And the side that killed the most birds, I guess, got pie or something at the end. But that's what was going on. This individual who was associated with the Smithsonian decided that rather than kill birds, why not just count them? And so he set up something that took place on Christmas Day in 1900 to start with. And they went out and they counted birds. I think there were maybe 25 people involved in this initially, and they counted maybe 50 species of birds. Oh. This has gone on since then every year and has grown to an enormous thing, an enormous citizen science project today, where there are thousands and thousands of bird species counted, and all over the Western Hemisphere, the U.S., Canada, South America, every country in South America, and many other countries beyond the Western Hemisphere. So this is what's happened with the Christmas bird count, and it starts, it's not just Christmas anymore, it starts I think the 14th of December and runs to the 3rd or 4th of January.
Okay.
Each count is in a 25-mile diameter circle. The one here in Tucson is the Tucson Valley, and it goes north to Oro Valley, includes Sweetwater and many of the popular birding areas within the Tucson metro area.
Okay.
And the bird counts are something that novice birders or people who are interested in birding but don't feel that they have enough skills, don't want to, show their lack of skills in a group, can go and join a group. And the most important thing about the bird count is you'll have a leader who recognizes birds, but often the leaders cannot see every bird. And so it really, really helps to have novice birders, particularly young people who have better eyesight and better hearing than the elders who are conducting the bird count. And so they can say, oh, I see a bird up there on the left side of that at 2:00 on that oak tree. And everyone will look, and the leader or whoever is the birding expert, quote unquote, will identify it. But we would never have gotten that bird were it not for the novice birder who had better eyesight. So it's a good place to start birding because you can go and just say, I see a bird, and that's all you need to do. And that's the biggest help that you can do for bird counts. It really adds to the numbers. And Tucson Valley bird count is one of the highest numbered birds sighted in all of the United States. I think there's only one other area that sees more birds than Tucson. So it's really very competitive. And there's a publication that comes out later on in the year that gives every circle's identification numbers, and it's very interesting, very informative to what's happening and birding with birds from year to year in different areas.
Yeah. Speaking of being out birding, both of you have been birding for quite some time. When you're out birding, what is one thing that you have to remind yourself of? Bob.
Well, I have to remind myself to not just look up for birds. I was birding in my backyard one day, and we have an olive tree. We have a pond and a waterfall and an olive tree. And there was a strange bird in the olive tree, and I didn't have my binoculars, so I wanted to walk closer to see the bird.
Sure.
And I walked closer, and I still couldn't see him. I walked closer, and I walked into the pond.
Oh.
I almost drowned. But
the pond is 3 feet deep and
I
8
almost
feet
hit my
wide.
head on a rock.
Oh.
Yeah.
There was another day when Prudy and I were walking a trail, and I was looking up as usual, and walked right over a rattlesnake that was stretched across the trail, which Prudy screamed and made me aware of. And
Yes.
I guess I was looking down while he was looking up.
Are you hearing this Bell's Vireo?
Oh, yeah.
There's a Bell's
there's
Vireo
Bell's.
singing here. That's really pretty. He sings a song, Where Did I Put My Keys? Never mind, I found my keys.
Oh.
Where did I put my keys? Never mind, I found my keys.
That's the
That's that
prosody.
Okay. I know he's been very vocal while we were talking.
They are. They've just arrived, so they need to announce themselves. They're migrants.
Okay.
So my answer to that question would be to stay aware of where you're stepping, where don't just look for birds.
Sure. What about you, Prudy?
Well, the number one thing that occurs to me when I go birding and I tend to be a very impatient, quick-moving kind of person, and the most important thing about birding is just to be patient. You're not on a hike, you're not on a walk, you're not there to cover territory, you're there to see birds. So sometimes you just have to sit, and if you see any movement at all, just sitting somewhere or standing and not moving until you actually can see the bird. And often they'll come out because you're not moving, and they'll be curious, so they'll move out and to see where you are. So it really does help to be very, very patient and not feel like you have to cover ground or cover area. And I always use my walking sticks because with my walking sticks I can walk and look ahead without having to look at my feet.
Oh.
And another thing is I have to remind myself, as I said, I like to move a lot, and you have to stop moving when you see a bird, because a bird will not be bothered by you talking to your partner or talking to yourself, or they're not disturbed by voices, but they are disturbed by movement. And one of the first thing that beginning birders and even, more intermediate birders like we are want to do is, look at that bird over there, and you go point to it. Well, the first thing that happens when you point to a bird is the bird sees the movement.
Yeah.
And when that movement occurs, that bird's off because they felt that there was a threat. But if you just say something like, the bird's up in the left quadrant of that tree, then, and not move, they will not be bothered by your voice. They will not fly away. And just, if you can, we do it ourselves. Like we say, what was that bird over there? And you point. But the pointing is something I have to remind myself constantly not to do, because the birds are frightened about movement.
Yeah, they pay attention to the movement.
The other thing, wear clothing to match your habitat.
Yeah.
And there's a book that's been written that's funny to read. It's called Birders Never Wear White.
Oh.
And one of the things that you should avoid if you're going out on a Christmas bird count or your first trip is birders avoid white, because white is something that birds are startled by. Just try to blend with the environment by wearing browns and grays and greens.
That's good to know. When you're out birding, what do you enjoy most about birding?
Well, I enjoy being outside, being in nature, the environment, beautiful surroundings. Prudy and I, from 1990 and for about 20 years, while we were working, we spent all our vacation time scuba diving. So it's quite the opposite of birding, because you're underwater, not above water. But it's very similar to birding in many ways, because you're exploring a beautiful environment, corals, things that grow underwater, anemones, all of the gorgeous fish that are underwater.
Sure.
And we took pictures of them, videos of them, and we tried to identify the fish we would see. We're too old to go scuba diving now, but birding is a great substitute because we're doing basically the same thing. We're in a beautiful environment. We're seeing things that are exotic, and we're trying to identify the birds that we see. That's why I love to go birding.
For me, birding is like going on an Easter egg hunt. You just never quite know where that egg is going to be hidden, and when you find it, it's like finding a hidden treasure. So you feel rewarded by that. And I love being out in nature like Bob does. We both love breathing the fresh air and not having to rush. Being outdoors doesn't have to be an exercise. And for us, it's stimulating to our minds and to our memories. And another thing that I like to do when I'm out is I'm always looking for rocks that I can pick up and add to my rock garden. Oh. I look at flowers and trees. It's very important to know about because frequently that's where birds will be. And you can say, if you recognize the tree, even if you don't know it's an emery oak versus a pioneer oak, you can say, oh, in that oak tree on the right side, there is a bird. And what is it? And it's the same way with desert hackberries, particularly to recognize some of the desert trees so that you can say, instead of pointing, you can say, oh, there's a bird there in the hackberry. And so it increases your knowledge about botany and geology, as well as ornithology.
Ties them all together.
Yeah, ties them together.
Bob, when did you first take an interest in birding?
Well, Prudy has always been interested in birding, and I've been since I was a little kid, I've always been interested in nature. But not specifically birding. I was kind of a generalist.
Okay.
I knew just enough about many things to be dangerous, but not enough about any one subject to be anything close to an expert. I had an interest in birds, but Prudy and I, after we got married, we've been married 45 years.
47.
47 years. Early in our marriage, we would go to some place that was known for its birds, and we would go there because Prudy was interested in seeing the birds. And we'd pull up in the parking lot, and Prudy would leave me. I would read the newspaper, take a nap, and Prudy would go looking for birds. In 2008, after we moved to Arizona, I took a class from a guy named Rick Wright, who was a classics professor back on the East Coast.
In Princeton,
Yale.
Okay.
He moved to Tucson, gave up his career in education, and formed a bird company and a guiding company where he would take people out and he would teach classes. He taught a number of classes. We took a class that was presented at Saddlebrook where we live, and it was a master class in birding, an introductory class in birding.
Okay.
And he just really, really turned me on to birding. His approach was something that I could really identify with. We had been on a number of guided bird walks, but they were boring. You know, the leader would just point to birds, identify them, and we'd move on to the next bird. Oh. But Rick, on the other hand, would take the time to explain something about the bird, and his approach was such that he would talk anecdotally about the birds. You know, what's different about this bird from other birds? What is different about its habitat, its behavior? How can you identify this bird against a similar-looking bird, and so on? Anyway, I became obsessed with birding. That was in 2008. And as I've told Prudy since then, be careful what you wish for, because I'm the one who's collecting all the bird books. I'm the one who's saying, isn't it time we let another bird walk? Can't we go to this particular park because they've got birds I don't know about, and so on.
When you think back further, what is your earliest memory of a bird?
Well, you know, I'm building a family record of, for people, members of our families. I've got old stuff that my mother kept and my father kept, and I found some drawings that I had made using crayons. I don't know how old I was, but some of those drawings were rudimentary enough that I had to have been pretty young. And I had drawings of cardinals, bluebirds, blue jays, and so on. And I remember those birds from where we lived when I was young.
Which was Kansas City, Missouri.
In Kansas City, Missouri. And we had feeders out in the back, bird feeders, and so birds would come, and I got introduced to them. The first real clear recollection of being strongly impressed by a bird was when I was a Boy Scout, and I was walking by myself across a field, and I came upon a nest with young in it. It was an indigo bunting nest.
On the ground. They're ground
Yeah,
nesters.
and they nest either on the ground or real close to the ground. And it had baby birds in it. And that was something that I never forgot.
That's a beautiful memory. And so our audience knows we will actually have some of those pictures you drew in the show notes on the website after.
Okay.
Prudy, when did you first take an interest in birding?
Well, when I was little, I'm from an Italian family, first generation, and we had chickens in Martinez, California, where we lived. And I was never afraid of the chickens like my sisters were. So I was always in charge of feeding them. My sisters were afraid they'd fly at their faces, but maybe because they were a little smaller. But I loved those chickens. And one day my dad gave me a Banty rooster and a hen, and I got to raise them on my own. So chickens, I know, sometimes we don't think of them as birds, but that was my first introduction to liking things with feathers. And plus, my dad was a hunter, and I often would sometimes have to pluck the feathers from the ducks, geese, quail, or doves that he killed. Or I would sit there with him plucking feathers, and it became a bonding time between him and me. So those feathers were never, ew, these are it's awful. Why do I have to do this? It was really a special time with my dad. So enjoying the feathers and talking to him about how beautiful the colors were and pointing them out. I was probably just 6, 7, or 8 when we did this. And I also loved to play in secret forts down by our creek, and I'd try to be really still so the birds would approach me. And I've identified birds as long as I can remember. I used to want to know what their names were. And when I was raising my boys, I taught them how to identify birds and give them the names. And they still talk about how they could impress girls when they were in high school because they knew the names of the common birds, and girls really thought that was cool.
How funny.
So they got a few dates that way.
Leading bird walks, you probably encounter plenty of new birders and are often asked for advice. What is a piece of advice you would share with our listeners who may be new to birding?
Well, for people who are new to birding, I would say a couple of things. In the first place, wherever you live, you should familiarize yourself with the birds in your own space. Your home, your yard birds. And you can begin keeping a list of the bird species that you run into in your yard. You need to know what those birds are, what their names are, and you need to learn that before you branch out and go out into the field. The sooner you understand what those birds are and what their names are, you'll get to a point where you see a different bird and you immediately recognize this is something different. And then that leads to another new bird and so on. Beyond knowing the birds in your own yard, probably the best way to familiarize yourself with birds is to go on bird walks. All of the state parks, almost all of them, if not all of them, conduct bird walks sometimes 2, 3, 4 times a week. These are not charged for. You need to sometimes pay admission into state parks.
Sure.
But bird walks are given by volunteers in those parks, and they're free. They're not limited with the number of people that participate. And I would really encourage new birders to participate as much as possible in that, because that's how they'll learn new birds. That's how they'll learn to recognize the calls and songs of birds and to recognize what to look for to identify birds.
So just getting that exposure.
Yeah, getting that exposure. I should say that Prudy and I also lead bird walks. We lead bird walks for Tucson Audubon, and we lead bird walks on our own that aren't sponsored by Tucson Audubon. We have an email, bobandprue@gmail.com, and any one of your listeners who is interested in knowing more about, we put together an irregular email about once a month that we send out to the birders on our email list. We have about 350 people on that list, and that's where we announce bird walks that we're going to conduct in the future. With COVID, we haven't had bird walks for a year, and we just restarted those in March of this year, and we're now back to doing small numbers of people bird walks in the area.
Nice. I'm sure that's helpful for people to know if they want to participate in that. Coming back to you, Prudy, what piece of advice would you share?
Well, just to continue where Bob was, Bob and I have a blog called Birding the Brook and Beyond.
And I'll link that in the show notes.
Okay. And because that's another place where you could get specific articles that Bob has written or might have written, and photographs of going probably for the last 10 years. So there's interesting articles you might want to access on that blog.
Okay.
But as far as a valuable resource for bird identification, Bob and I are in the older generation. I'm 78. Bob is 85. And we like to think that birding is keeping us young because it's keeping our minds stimulated and keeping us out there walking and trying to keep our balance as we move around in those rough trails.
Sure.
The thing that's missing the most, there are two things I think that we miss just because of our age. And one of them is we both were, maybe me more than Bob, started birding by sight. And sight, looking at a bird was the most important thing. That's how you found birds. Sure. But I really like to encourage younger birders and young people, my grandchildren, children, to listen to what the bird says. If you can be a birder by ear, you are a far superior birder than anybody who birds by sight. Because birding sounds, the sounds, songs, and calls that birds make are distinctive. They're much more distinctive than coloration or size or anything, even habitat, because birds can be out of place. They can be molting. They can be in their breeding plumage or not. And so birds can vary in terms of what they look like, but birds never vary in terms of what they sound like. You can always tell the difference between one flycatcher and the other, even if they're almost identical by the way they sound. And this couple of days ago, we were down in the Chiricahuas, and in the meadows there, we saw meadowlarks, and one was on a fence and we could hear it singing, and we said, whoa, that does not sound like our familiar western meadowlark. And we said, oh, that's because that's an eastern meadowlark. Well, we probably would never have known had we not heard it. So young people have better ears than we do, and that's one area that they can excel in, and older birders should not emphasize the looking at the birds. They should emphasize listening to a bird. And the other thing is technology. And Bob and I have been involved in the computer field for a long time, but we didn't grow up there. And finding apps on the computer, there's iBird. I love iBird. And there's also Sibley. And what are some of the others, son?
Audubon.
There's an Audubon. These are apps that you can put onto your phone, and they are free many times.
Sure.
And if you think you know the name of it, you pretty much have to know the name of it. But if you can find the name or guess what it looks like, they'll have a section in there that says similar birds, so you can see what birds look like that might be like that bird. And also they will be able to have bird sounds. They have the bird calls and songs on there. So I would say that that apps for your phone are really, really useful. You can even study it on your own when you're in the car playing games. You can go and look at your birding app, and it'll help you to remember some of the birds that you're looking for. As far as a field guide, Bob and I both like to use field guides when we guide people, because people like to see pictures of what they didn't see really well in the tree. And the one I like to use is Richard Taylor's Birds of Southeastern Arizona, because it's a very simple book. It's very small, fits into your pocket, and he will give three, like the Juncos. He'll give all three of the juncos on the same page.
Yeah.
So you can see where they are, and he'll show a graph on when you can find them in the winter and what elevation. So there's a lot of information on that, and it's a pretty new book, so it's pretty recent information that he has.
Okay.
But we both like Sibley's field guides, and I like National Geographic field guides. Those are things that really help you to support your interest in birds.
One of the things that stood out with what you shared was focusing on the sounds of birds. And from what I hear, maybe the best way for me to become more familiar with bird sounds would be just poking around the app and listening to different birds.
Absolutely.
Okay.
If you could identify a bird, like I recognize like that bird that we're hearing here, that is the Bell's Vireo. Oh, that's a Bell's Vireo. Well, you may not see anything, but sooner or later you will see something moving, and then you can identify the bird. And if you can identify a bird by sound and call, first, you will see far more birds than waiting until you have to sight them, because they just often don't let themselves be seen, but they will be calling, especially in the spring.
Yeah. Well, that is a skill I will have to brush up on. Thinking of purchases you've made under $100, what is something that you've purchased related to your birding experience that has had the greatest impact?
Well, that's an easy one. The birding apps are all available for less than $100. And there are subtle differences from one app to another, but a birding app is like having a field guide on your phone or on an iPad.
Sure.
We use both actually, but when we lead field trips, we carry our iPad because it's larger, the screen is larger, we can share the pictures of the birds that are on there, and the sound system is better, so that if you want to use playback to play the song of a Bell's Vireo or some other bird, you can do that. You can use that to instruct the participants in your bird walk, or just for your own edification.
Yeah.
Field guides can cost you $25, $40
Sure.
or more, and they have all the photographs or the drawings of the birds. They're well organized. They have the distribution maps and so on. But an app on your phone or iPad gives you every bit of that. The Sibley app that we have has everything that's in the Sibley field guide to birds. And then in addition, it has like 900 songs and calls of 900 species of birds found in North America. So that would be the most important thing. I think there are three things that are very important to birders. Whether or not you can get them for $100 or less, it may be questionable. But those three things are a birding app, binoculars. They should be designed for birders, which would be 8x42, 8x42 binoculars. Binoculars you're not going to get for decent ones for under $100, but under $200 or $300 you can easily get good binoculars.
Yeah.
And the third thing, this is a different question, I know, but
That's okay.
But the third thing is a camera. And you can get a workable camera, a point and shoot camera, for less than $100. And a camera, better than anything else, will aid beginning birders and experienced birders, for that matter, in bird identification. I use my camera all the time for that. We'll see a bird, we'll be out in the field, and the bird may be 200 yards away sitting on a post, and you're not certain what it is. You can take photographs, and then you get home, put them on your computer, blow the pictures up, and then make an identification. The photograph of the bird may not be something you want to sell to a magazine, but it may be far clear enough to allow exact identification.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, you just reminded me of the fact that if you are taking a photo of a bird, you can also do a video. And if you do a video, you'll catch the bird's call. So that bird you were just saying, I'm hearing a bird here. What is this? And you played it for us.
Yeah.
And then we said, oh yeah, it sounds like a Lucy's warbler.
Yeah.
So that's another really good way if you can do a recording of the bird that you're hearing, but you don't see, or if you do see, it's very quick, and you can play somebody that recording and they might be able to identify it for you.
Yeah. So between the recording of the audio and then also having a picture, you might have a better chance. I've noticed photography has helped me a lot with bird identification, because out in the field, some of these birds will just pop in and then pop out, and you won't see them again. But if I can snap a few pictures when I go home, zoom in, and then leaf through my few different books or apps, then I can finally figure out, oh, this is an American pipit, and then identify what I saw.
Well, we have 350 people on our email list in lead bird walks, and we get emails all the time from people who say, I saw a bird. It was about the size of a cardinal. It was yellow with an orange throat, and that's it.
Yeah.
And I'd say, you didn't by chance take a photograph of it, did you?
Yeah. What is some advice you might share, Prudy, to a new birder?
Well, one of the things that Bob talked about, Rick Wright, who was a classical professor, who talked about the gestalt of a bird, and that's always stuck with me because as a birder from the time I was little, I always looked at the color of the bird. And most people do look at color. Oh, it was a red bird. And we look at size, but color and size are variable depending on season, depending on lighting, and it's not a very predictable way to identify a bird. So if you talk about the gestalt, which is the general impression of a bird, more than just size and color, where the bird is located, what's the habitat? Is it a field? Is it near water? Is it in the desert? That'll help you identify what kind of a bird it is. What is the bill like? If a bird eats seeds, it's got a very fat bill, like a finch, and is broad at the top. And if it's a warbler, it's a little skinny needle bill. And there's bill size, like our two birds I'm thinking of right now. One of them is a ruby-crowned kinglet, and the other one is the Hutton's Vireo. And they're almost identical, but if you focus on their bill size rather than color or size, because those are going to be the same. If you look at the bill, and that's the gestalt, it's where was this bird? What is it doing? Is it going around the tree? What's its bill like? Is it going up and down the tree? Is it sitting still looking at me? Those are pieces that will help you to classify and identify a bird. And what does the bird sound like? Does it have a lilting song? Does it have a raspy croak? How does it fly? Lots of woodpeckers will fly in an undulating flight, and all you'll see is a bird flying from one tree to another, but you can say, well, color, size was hard to tell, but it had an undulating flight, and somebody will immediately tell you, well, I know it's a woodpecker. So you can look at the whole of a bird rather than just the parts. That's the most important thing I think that Rick taught us, and that was very different from the way I learned birding when I was a kid.
Yeah. And definitely the points you've both made, just telling our listeners that it's so much more than just the visual. We have the audio, and then we also have the behavior of the bird. So paying attention to these pieces, and even something as specific as a beak. Some might be more likely to pay attention to, oh, it had a bright red, it had a bright yellow. But instead, just noticing that beak, that it had a thicker beak or a thinner beak, might be more helpful in identifying that bird. That's good to know.
Exactly.
Now let's move on to our bird segment, where my guests have a chance to share a bit about a bird of their choice. For this episode, Bob has chosen the Cactus Wren, and Prudy has chosen the Crested Caracara. Bob, with a name that includes the word cactus, to what extent does that describe the wren?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a very good descriptor, because this is a bird that has no fear of cactus. Cactus spines are meaningless to the bird. I've got many photographs of cactus wrens perched on cactus.
Yes.
And they build their nests in cactus. They build a nest out of sticks, small sticks, and they'll build them within a cholla or a prickly pear or some other large cactus. Yeah, cactus wren, why did I pick a cactus wren? That'd be a good question. And I picked a cactus wren. I mean, I could pick hundreds of birds and talk about any one of them, and they would be my favorite bird of the moment. Cactus wren is a unique bird for Arizona because it's a state bird of Arizona. And every state in the U.S. has a state bird. And you would think with about 900 species of birds in the U.S. that 50 states could have their own unique bird.
Yeah.
The first state that named a state bird was Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
And they named the northern cardinal. I think there's 6 states that surround Kentucky, touch Kentucky one way or the other.
Sure.
And every one of those states also named the northern cardinal as their state bird, which seems kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
Of the 50 states, 30 of our states, 60% of our states, share their state bird with at least one other state.
Wow.
Northern mockingbird, chickadees, multiple birds are named more than once.
Roadrunner, a lot of states.
No, only one state. New Mexico
really?
is the only state that has the roadrunner.
Ah, okay.
And Arizona is the only state that has cactus wren.
Yeah.
Cactus wren, I think, is a beautiful pick for Arizona. I'm going to let this airplane go by here.
Sure.
Arizona, like many states, has decided on state flowers, state trees, various and sundry items that are associated with the state have official designation. In Arizona, we have a state flower, the saguaro flower. Mm-hmm. The tree is the palo verde. And Arizona goes beyond that. Arizona has the state rattlesnake. We have, I think, 14 or 16 species of rattlesnake in Arizona, and one of them, the ridge-nosed rattlesnake, is the official state rattlesnake. Arizona also has an official tie, the bolo tie.
Yeah.
I don't know if New Mexico also has that, but Arizona has a bolo tie. Arizona also has an official state pistol, Colt pistol. So it's not surprising that Arizona would pick a cactus wren, a unique bird, and a bird that no other state has chosen. The cactus wren, in the United States, we have 10 wrens. Mm-hmm. Wrens are found all over the world, but in the U.S., we have 10 different species of wren. All of the other wrens, all of the other 9 wrens, except the cactus wren, are small, furtive, elusive, drab-colored, beautiful singing birds that are hard to find, hard to spot, both because of coloration and because of their own proclivity to hide out and not be noticed.
Yeah.
The cactus wren is exactly opposite of this. The cactus wren is boldly patterned. It's boisterous. It's brash. It's inquisitive. It's a curious bird. And it's also the largest of all of our wrens. Most of these other wrens are like 6 or 7 inches at the most. Cactus wrens are 8.5 inches. They're big birds. And they're in-your-face birds. They attack other bird nests. They'll destroy other birds' eggs, even their own species, even other cactus wrens.
Wow.
I saw a cactus wren peck a house finch to death once.
Oh.
I had my hat knocked off my head once by a cactus wren. I was outside leaning against a table, and a cactus wren came in behind me, unseen by me, and landed directly in the middle of my back with, it felt like an anvil hitting my back. Oh. I have no idea why he did that, but they just have a mean streak. They're a bird that, given a chance, they'd wear a bolo tie and carry a Colt. So they're a perfect Arizona state bird.
When you think about their diet, what kinds of things are these cactus wren eating?
Well, they eat insects mostly. At our feeders, they'll eat freeze-dried mealworms. Outside of the feeders, they don't eat much birdseed that I can tell. but they do pick. They're more like a thrasher than they are other wrens.
Okay.
Although other wrens eat insects as well, but cactus wrens, you'll see them on the ground, pecking at gravel, digging through gravel. And by the way, that reminds me of something else I wanted to say about the cactus wren.
Sure.
Every bird has a scientific name, a two-part name that consists of a genus, which is like a family, or it's within a family, and then they have the species name. Cactus wren, scientific name is a mouthful. And I have to take a look here. It's not that I can do this without looking, but I prefer looking. Campi larynxus brownicapillus. 10 syllables. That's a mouthful.
Yeah.
What it means is brown-capped curvebill.
Okay.
And it's got a bill that reminds you of a curvebill thrasher. It's a pretty solid bill. And they use that for digging in gravel and digging up bugs and insects.
Okay. I also know one fact I came across when I was reading up on cactus wren was that they have multiple broods a year, which isn't something that's necessarily common among many birds.
Well, it's not real uncommon because a lot of birds do have multiple broods, but a lot of birds don't, too.
Okay.
I think multiple broods more often is connected to climate, drought, other factors. Success in breeding is also a key factor. If a pair of birds lay 2 or 3 or 4 eggs and none of them succeed, they fail in hatching birds, then they're more inclined to have a second brood, or a third brood. Some birds almost every year have 2 or 3 broods.
Okay.
But other birds are responsive to success on the nest and weather conditions. If it's drought, then that affects how many broods they have and so on. Quail is a good example. We see quail this last year. We had more quail than we've seen in 20 years living here. And I think they had multiple broods, and I think they had multiple successful broods.
Does this this number of broods have any connection to the number of nests that these cactus wren have?
Not directly. Cactus wrens, we were going to talk about nests a little bit.
Yeah. Cactus
wrens do build more than one nest, and I believe the male is the one who's primarily responsible. He'll build a nest in a cactus. He'll show it to his mate, and his mate may reject it. So then he has to go out and build another nest. So it isn't that they roost in one nest and then lay eggs in another. It's more a case of she's picky and there's something about that nest she doesn't like. Verdon is a small bird, desert bird also, about 4 inches long. It's got a greenish yellow head and a cinnamon epaulette on one shoulder of each wing.
I'll be sure to link a picture in the show notes so our audience knows.
Yeah, that's a bird that builds a nest that is way disproportionate to the size of the bird. It looks like a football.
Oh.
It's a oblong, round contraption.
Yeah.
And like Prudy mentioned, I think a few minutes ago, they have the whole. It's not a cup nest that like many nests of birds are. Instead of being a cup, it's a sealed round container, and it has a hole on the lower half of the nest, and the birds fly into this hole, and this protects them against predators.
Yeah.
So that instead of being wide open at the top, it's closed at the top, and birds have to fly in from the side or bottom.
Sure.
Verdons build nests both for roosting and for nesting.
Okay.
So they'll have a nest, and if they decide to build another nest, they may or may not use the same nest, but they may then build a second nest for roosting if they have a second brood. But in the winter, they'll build another nest where they are just protected from the cold.
Okay.
I think it's the male that builds the nest in the verdants. He builds the first nest. He builds the first nest, and that is the one that he lures the female to and says, look what a beautiful house I've built.
Yes.
And wouldn't you love to live here with me? And she either rejects it or accepts it, and then that's her nest. And then he'll build a brooding nest separate from her nest. And the last nest he builds is one for himself.
Oh.
So they don't occupy the same nests.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something else. Verdant, male looks like the female. You can't tell males and females apart.
Okay.
Which is true of many species of birds. And one way you can tell them apart is when they're building a nest.
Okay.
If you see a verdant carrying a stick, you know it's a male. And the male verdant constructs the nest structure itself, the outside, everything except the lining.
Okay.
If you see a bird carrying down or a feather or something like that, a verdant, you know it's a female verdant.
Okay.
Because they are the ones who line the nest inside the structure of the nest itself.
How funny. Is there anything else you wanted to share with us about the cactus wren?
Cactus wrens, in a way, are very similar to Arizona retirees because they're monogamous.
Mm-hmm.
They have a single mate. They adapt well to the desert neighborhoods, and when they meet their mate, they growl.
That's a good one.
That's familiar.
Oh, and and another thing I did forget to mention is that when comparing cactus wrens to other wrens are very melodious singers. They have beautiful songs and a variety of songs. Mm-hmm. A cactus wren's song is as far from melodious as you could get. It sounds a lot like a duck quacking or somebody starting a 24 Ford automobile by cranking it. That sounds like a cactus wren. To me, it's a beautiful, beautiful sound. I hear it on a hot desert morning in the spring, like right now. Cactus wrens are singing like crazy because they're nesting and establishing territories. And it's a beautiful sound, but it's not melodious.
And speaking of wrens, reminds me, I'm just getting off the topic, but just have to say something about the canyon wren because new birders will have heard this wren, especially people who do hiking. And you go to any of the places where there are rocks or rock climbing or any kind of canyon. And this is the canyon wren. It's a beautiful rufous red bird, but you don't often see it. But when you're hiking in places like the first time I think we heard it was in Montezuma's castle that they're going up, or any place where there's lots of hillsides and canyons, and it just sounds like flowing water, and it starts high and goes down like that. And so you feel like you're listening to a waterfall, and people will recognize that song and say, whoa, what is that? And that's a bird where you really do want to listen for it when you're on a hike because it is an incredible call. And everybody we take on bird hikes, we'll play that so people can hear it because you often do not see that bird, but it will really strike you. It pulls you into birding because that song is just so alluring.
How nice. So today you were going to share with us a bit about the Crested Caracara. A previous guest, actually, in episode number 2, Dan mentioned the Crested Caracara because of their exceptional intelligence and commented on their behaviors and ability to adapt to situations.
Exactly. I have a lot of favorite birds, but Crested Caracara is particularly interesting to me because it's a bird that has come up here from Mexico, and Bob and I do a lot of traveling in Mexico. We love the Mexican people, the population. We love birding down there, and we take groups down there sometimes and friends, and we speak Spanish, so it makes it easier for us to travel there. Sure. This is a bird that we always look for when we go down there. Whenever we're with another couple, I'll say the first one to see the caracara gets, and I'll have a little wrapped gift under my seat, and that person gets the present because we're just so excited to see them again. But they are actually moving up into the southern part of Arizona for quite a while. I think since 2002, they were recognized and documented in the Tohono O'odham Indian Reservation and at the borders. Yeah. And now they're moving into the Santa Cruz Flats, where Dan has seen them, and a lot of us have seen them up there. Yeah. Because they're like agricultural fields. They're almost always near water. And they're an opportunistic bird. They'll find carrion. They'll look for vultures, and they'll chase the vultures off, and they will eat a dead animal. The last time we saw them was in Santa Cruz Flats, and I saw some movement way, way, way off in a field, and I looked, and there were 5 caracaras on a dead carcass of a cow. Wow. And you wouldn't have noticed it if you couldn't see the cow, but the birds were just flittering over the top. And they are aggressive. They're bullies. They're very, very intelligent. They're actually, even though they seem like they're vultures, they look like a vulture. They've got a big, heavy yellow bill. They've got a hairless, featherless part of their face. Their head is white, and then they've got what looks like a really bad black toupee on the top of the white head, and there's a lot of red on their face where there's no feathers. And so they do look like vultures, but they're actually members of the falcon family. Oh. And so they're related to the sleek and swift peregrine falcon, but crested caracaras fly a lot less than they walk. And you'll never see a peregrine falcon walking along on the ground, but you will see crested caracaras. And they have a wingspan over 4 feet. So they're a very, very large bird of prey. And they're actually considered the smartest of all the birds of prey. So that's a pretty high designation for a bird, because there's a lot of very smart hawks. Sure. And they're huge, and they look distinctive. They're called the inquisitive clowns in the raptor world because they're curious or social. They're brave with many interests and few skills. Reminds me what Bob was saying. We're both interested in birds that show a lot of unique characteristics and inquisitiveness and aggression, because then people notice them. Besides eating carrion, they like to eat insects, so they'll scratch the ground like chickens, or remind you of a chicken if you see them out in a field. They also eat frogs and mice, and they bully other birds. They steal food. They, like humans, they share this uncontrollable urge to discover something. They're always looking for something new. And that's what fascinates me about them, because they're an endangered, or threatened, actually. They're a threatened species, even in Mexico. But they have, in spite of being threatened, they don't stay in safe places. They search for new habitats, and that's why they have come into Texas, small part of Louisiana, and southern Arizona. So you're lucky if you can see one here. But they're very adaptable. They're considered obstinate but flexible. They're constantly seeking new horizons, looking for new places to explore. So that's kind of fun to see a bird with that. Of course, we're anthropomorphizing here, but still, it's still fun to see a bird that seems inquisitive and adaptable. The interesting thing, too, is their lifespan, the recorded lifespan for a captive bird by the Arizona Desert Museum, was 42 years. So they can live a very long time.
Yes. For this last question, I would like to touch on something we discussed before we started recording, when I asked you about something in the birding world that you were passionate about. And could you share, I think you mentioned something about lists, Bob.
Yeah, a lister is someone who keeps track of all of the species of birds that he sees or she sees. In the world, there are about 10,000 species of birds. And there are some people whose goal in life is to see all of those species. You have to be pretty wealthy to pursue that, because what you see here is not what you see in Australia, or not what you see in Europe or any other country. Of all the countries in the world, Colombia, which is at the northern part of South America, just below Panama, Colombia is smaller than our state of Alaska. And yet Colombia has recorded the most number of species of birds of any country in the world. Wow. which makes it really fortunate for anyone living in the United States because it's easy to get to Columbia. It's not expensive to get to Columbia, and you can hire a bird guide in Columbia easily, and you get to see a lot of birds.
Yeah.
Columbia has more species of birds than other countries because a number of factors. It's right at the junction of two continents, Central America, North America, and South America, and it borders on both the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. There's one major mountain range that runs the length of South America, starting at the bottom in between Argentina and Chile, and then goes north. And this one mountain range, when it gets to Columbia, actually splits into three separate mountain ranges.
Mm-hmm.
So Columbia has multiple mountain ranges, multiple oceans,
The Amazon.
and the Amazon jungle, which I was going to mention next.
Oh.
Thank you, Ann. And it's we spent a month birding in Columbia and would love to go back. Columbia, unfortunately, has not been a safe place to bird because of civil war that lasted for decades in Columbia. We happened to go down there just as they were reaching a peace accord with the rebels in the jungles. And we weren't able to go everywhere we wanted to in Columbia, but we were able to go to many places, and we recorded more than 200 species of birds. We had well, in fact, I think it's more than...
Oh, yeah, more than 300.
More than 300, yeah, close to 400 species. So that's a good country to go to if you're a lister. Now, not everybody who's in birding is a lister. I'm not sure that Prudy probably wouldn't qualify as a lister because she doesn't go out of her way to keep track of birds. And part of that may be because I do.
Yeah.
And she's typically with me. I rarely bird without Prudy.
Sure.
So my list becomes Prudy's list. So she doesn't have to do the...
The problem is when you start looking at birds and identifying them from the time you're a kid, by the time you're in your 50s and 60s and you hear about lists, it's a little too late to start recording what you've seen.
Well, in my case, I didn't really start birding until 2008.
Sure.
So, I was pretty old, over 65 years of age. But even so, so far, well, I should say that I use eBird to record my birds.
Yes.
There are many apps that you can use. eBird, I think, is by far the best one. And it's a giant database, and it's very user-friendly. And eBird has identified hotspots, what eBird calls hotspots. Tohono Chul, this park here, is undoubtedly a hotspot. And if we were to do birding here, and we would keep track of the birds that we see, we could enter them through an app on an iPhone, or we could just keep track of them on paper, and then when we get home, key them into our computer.
Yeah.
Either way. And once you've done that, that individual list becomes what's called a checklist. And then however number of species you see, maybe we would see 20 or 30 species here at Tohono Chul by spending a couple hours this morning here. What eBird does is it keeps track of both the number of species, the count of each of those birds that you see, and the number of checklists that you record. So in my case, since 2008, I've recorded over 1,100 checklists,
Wow.
which is quite a few. And number of species, for me, it's 1,441 as of today. That can change without me doing anything because bird species sometimes are combined. Sometimes they're split. If they split a species, like Pacific flycatcher was split into Pacific slope flycatcher and Cordilleran flycatcher. And when that happened, I gained a species without doing any work. Same thing happened with magnificent hummingbird. Just a couple of years ago, magnificent hummingbird was split into Talamanca hummingbird found in Costa Rica.
Mm-hmm.
And then the magnificent hummingbirds north of Costa Rica became Rivoli's hummingbird, which was a name that was used before magnificent hummingbird. And there again, I just spent a leisurely morning having breakfast and gained a new species. But at the same time, I've lost a species because I was at 1442. I have no idea what bird I lost. They don't advise you. They don't tell you. We just combined these two species, so you just lost a bird.
Yeah.
Anyway, that represents about 14% of the total number of species in the world. 10,000 roughly, give or take. And my greatest regret, because we spent 20 years scuba diving, and we went scuba diving in Egypt, the Red Sea, 2 big trips to Southeast Asia, where we went to Borneo, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia. Sulawesi, part of Indonesia, but different islands.
Yeah.
Indonesia consists of 16,000 islands, and we have been on a number of them.
Yeah.
And we recorded some birds that we saw in each of those places, but very few of those places did we make an effort to note all the bird species we saw.
Yeah.
So I've been able to go back and reconstruct some of those, but my big regret is that I spent 20 years scuba diving and traveling all over the world, and I didn't take the time to look above water. I recorded lots of fish species,
Yes.
but I missed out on a lot of bird species.
With this list and with these numbers you've mentioned, do you still have some sort of goal? Do you have a number in mind, or is it just let me build my list?
No, I don't really have a a number in mind. I mean, I'm too much of a realist to think that at 85 years of age, I can get close to 10,000 species. Even getting to numbers that are considered big would be 4,000 birds, 5,000 birds.
Okay.
There was a lady, her name was Phoebe
Snetzinger.
Netzinger, and
S-N-E-T, Snetzinger.
She was from Texas, I believe, and she was interested in birds, and she had recorded a number of birds, but not a huge number. And she was diagnosed with malignant melanoma, and she was told that she had a very limited lifespan ahead of her, like maybe 6 months to live. So she made a decision that she would see all the birds she could possibly see in that 6 months. Well, she lived well beyond the 6 months. She got her melanoma under control. She traveled all over the world. She had a lot of money. And I forget how many birds she got up to, but
I think it was 7,000.
yeah, she was over. There's a gnatcatcher.
Oh, yes.
That's a
Sure
blue-gray gnatcatcher, I believe. No, I think it's a
black-tailed.
It's a black-tailed gnatcatcher.
Yeah, it's got the 2 little marks on the tail.
Black-tailed gnatcatcher, beautiful bird.
Yes.
And you can tell that we get 2 gnatcatchers here, the blue-gray and the black-tailed. And you can only tell them apart by looking at the bottom of their tail, not at the top of the tail. And you can see all of the black on that tail.
Yeah.
And that's the bottom of the tail you're looking at. So that's how I know that it's not a blue-gray. A blue-gray would have very, very little black on the underside of the tail.
And because that is mostly black.
Yeah, and this is much, much more black than the blue-gray. It's also certainly our most common gnatcatcher.
Okay.
It's also got a little thin bill indicating it likes insects, gnats.
Yeah, and you see it hop around on the branches, which tells you that's likely to be a gnatcatcher.
Right.
And there is a third gnatcatcher in Arizona called the black-capped, which is, for the most part, a rare bird. We have seen it in the Tucson area, but that's a bird you rarely see, or you have to go to special locations like Florida Canyon to find them. So
you're telling us about Phoebe.
Thank you, Phoebe Netzinger. Yeah, she wound up seeing about 7,000 birds, and She was killed, actually. She didn't die of natural causes. She was killed in a car accident in Madagascar on a birding trip.
Her bus that she was on, birding on.
Oh.
Yeah. So for me, no, I don't have a goal, a specific number goal or anything like that. I would like to flesh out, at least get one or two species of birds from the countries I've been to in the past. And those would be trips that we took for reasons other than birding.
Sure.
But we both, Prudy and myself, and Prudy more than myself, have kept journals of those trips, and we also took photographs. So when I go back and I look at my old records, read the journal entries, or look at the photographs, I can very often find reference to or photographs of at least one or more, maybe 10 or more birds. And I would really like to complete my bird list at least to the extent of some species of birds from every country that I've been in. And I think that's completely doable.
Yeah.
It's just it's a project like many projects.
Yes.
It take a lot of time, but I think I can do it, and I would love to do that. I'd love to have at least one species of bird from every country we've been in. We've been in 52 countries, not just on scuba diving, but for many reasons.
It's quite a goal, but I think, as you mentioned, it is something you can do.
Yeah,
it's just a
it's-
matter of going back through those things, those memories.
Maybe I'll work on that this afternoon.
There you go.
It's a hot day.
Yes, a good day to be inside. Prudy, when we talked about this same subject, not the subject of lists, but the subject of something you were passionate about, you brought up owls. Can you tell us a little more, something more specific than owls?
Well, owls are fascinating. Anthropology major many years back, and there are a lot of traditions, a lot of history, a lot of stories about owls. Native tribes have talked about owls and their spirits. I'm particularly interested in owls because we don't see them very often, and they're only seen at night. Bob and I have used the Cornell Ornithology website's patterns to build nesting boxes and platforms for the great horned owl and for the western screech owl in our backyard. We still don't have any owls who have rented our nests, but we still have them out there. And also, Tucson Audubon sells nesting boxes.
Okay.
If you're interested in those, other than the western screech, they sell boxes for other birds too, for nesting, to put
We
in
have
trees.
one for Lucy's warbler.
Yeah, we have one for Lucy's warbler, and Lucy has not come and joined us either. But one of my greatest thrills was to go out at night and use playback to call elf owls when they arrive now, and they're starting to nest, and then they'll be gone by the end of June. And on one of my birthdays, we went out at night with a friend, and we called out the elf owls so you can see them. The problem with owls is you have to be out at night, and owling involves, I've never heard of anybody who's done any owling without doing playback. And playback is controversial. People refuse to use it, and people use it exclusively. It can be overused, particularly by photographers who want to get that perfect shot of the bird, and they'll call it, use it till the bird lands on their shoulder practically. And that's abusing playback. And playback should not be, there are a lot of places that restrict playback. You cannot use it in certain national parks and certain refuges. But if used judiciously and occasionally, it can teach you about birds. But playback is another issue that we could make a long conversation with. But owling pretty much does involve playback. And so that's one of the reasons that we don't see many owls, is because we don't do a lot of playback and we don't go out at night to do that. But they are fascinating birds. And I'm also passionate about reading and getting information on climate change and urbanization, because natural areas have been affected by climate change, and some birds have benefited from urbanization and houses being built. For example, Cooper's hawks. they're increasing their populations because people have taken over the desert, and they have put bird feeders up in their backyard, and the Cooper's hawks will come in and attack those birds that are at your feeders. So they're becoming their food supply has increased, so they're becoming more prolific.
Yes.
But a lot of bird populations are affected because they can't adapt. Black-throated sparrow is one that doesn't adapt to feeders. They don't come to feeders. If you take over their area, their nesting site and their habitat, they have no place to go.
Oh.
So then those birds become threatened, and so that's a big concern. And I know Cornell is doing a lot of research on which birds are being affected most by climate change and by urbanization. And it's interesting to see the populations increase or decrease depending on what bird you're talking about. So those are my passions in terms of birding. I think a lot of passions. It's hard to pick one.
I know, so many.
Yeah.
I appreciate you both sharing those too. Thank you both for joining us today, and I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow or subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you are listening to this episode from. You can visit lookingatbirds.com for show notes, a transcript of the episode, and pictures of the Crested Caracara and Cactus Wren taken by the Bowers. Until next time, keep looking at birds.